Today I want to tell you a story from the Bible that many people have never really noticed. It is a story about 5 sisters who were not afraid to speak up. Before we begin today's teaching, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to this channel. Here we share hidden stories of the Bible, lessons of faith and courage, and encouragement for everyday life. When you subscribe, you'll be the first to hear each new teaching, and it helps more people discover these messages. They are known as the Daughters of Zelophehad. Their names were Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah and Tirzah. These sisters lived a long time ago, but their courage still speaks to us today. The Bible says that it was the 40th year since the people of Israel left Egypt. They had been traveling in the desert for many years, following Moses and waiting for the day when they would enter the land that God had promised them. That land was called Canaan, the Promised Land. It was a new place where every family would receive a piece of land to live on and to pass down to their children. God told Moses that each tribe would receive land and that the land would be divided by a kind of lottery. Every man in the tribe would be given a portion within his tribe's area. When a man died, his son would inherit his property. This way the land stayed in the same family from one generation to the next. This was very important for the people of Israel. At this time Moses was commanded to take a census of all the men in Israel who were old enough to go to war. Each man was counted by his father's household. While reading through the names of the different families, we come across the family of a man called Zelophehad. Zelophehad was from the tribe of Manasseh. He had left Egypt with Moses and with the other Israelites. But now we are told something unusual. Zelophehad had no sons, only daughters. And the Bible gives us their names: Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah and Tirzah. Zelophehad had died in the desert, just like many of the people who had left Egypt. When he died, his daughters were left without a brother. This was a serious problem because, at that time, women were not usually allowed to take over their father's property. If nothing was done, their father's name and his share of the land would disappear from the family records. The daughters knew this. They could see what was about to happen, and they were troubled. They had grown up in a culture where only sons inherited land. They knew the customs. They knew the rules. Yet they also knew that God was just and that He had promised land to all the families of Israel. So these 5 sisters decided to act. They did not sit back and hope someone else would help them. They chose to come forward themselves. The Bible says that Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah and Tirzah went to Moses. They also went before Eleazar the priest, the leaders, and all the congregation. They stood at the entrance of the tabernacle, the special tent where God's presence was among His people. This was not an easy thing to do. They were women in a society led by men. They were standing before the leaders of the whole community. But they were brave. They believed in God's promise and they were willing to speak. When they reached Moses, they said something like this: "Our father died in the wilderness. He was not among the people who rose up against the Lord in the company of Korah. He died for his own sin, as everyone does. But he had no sons. Why should our father's name disappear from his family because he had no son? Give us an inheritance among our father's brothers." Can you hear their hearts? They were not trying to take what belonged to someone else. They were simply asking for the right to keep their father's name and his share in the land. They wanted their family to have a place in the promised land just like everyone else. They wanted to belong. This is where we pause. This is the moment when these 5 sisters step out of the shadows and into the light of history. We can imagine them standing there, Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah and Tirzah, at the door of the tabernacle, speaking with courage and faith. They believed that God would hear their cry. They believed that his leader Moses would listen. When Moses heard what Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah and Tirzah were saying, he did not answer them right away. He did not tell them, "Yes, you can have the land," and he did not tell them, "No, you cannot." Instead, Moses did something very wise. He went to God. Moses was the leader of a huge nation, but he knew he needed the Lord's guidance. Many leaders in his place might have brushed the women aside or made their own decision. But Moses was humble. He was a servant of God. When he faced a hard question, he asked God what to do. This is the heart of a true leader. So Moses brought the case of the daughters of Zelophehad before the Lord. He told God everything they had said. And God answered him. The Lord said to Moses, "The request of the daughters of Zelophehad is right. You must certainly give them an inheritance among their father's brothers and pass their father's share to them." Isn't that amazing? God listened to these 5 sisters. God approved their request. He did not say, "No, the law cannot be changed." He said, "Yes, give them their inheritance." And more than that, God used this moment to teach all of Israel something new. God told Moses, "Say to the Israelites, if a man dies and has no son, he shall give his inheritance to his daughter." This was a completely new instruction for the people. Until now, the inheritance always went to sons. But from that day on, God made it clear that daughters could inherit too, if there were no sons. This was a huge change. It showed God's fairness. It showed that He cares for all His children. He did not forget about these 5 sisters. He did not forget about their father's name. He gave them a place in the land, just like He gives all His people a place in His kingdom. The Hebrew words used here even hint at something deeper. The command, "give them," is written in the masculine form, as if to say that in this matter the women were to be treated as the men were treated. It was a picture of something greater, that the heavenly Canaan, which this land represented, belongs to women as well as to men. God was showing His people that His promises include everyone who believes. Think for a moment about the faith of these sisters. They were still in the wilderness when they made their request. They had not yet entered the promised land. But they believed God's promise so much that they were already thinking about their share in it. They were women of faith. They believed Israel would possess the land, and they wanted to be counted in. Because of their courage and their faith, the law of inheritance was made clearer for the whole nation. From then on the order of inheritance would be son, then daughter, then brother, then paternal uncle, and then the nearest relative in the clan. This protected family property and made sure that no one was left out. Some time passed after God told Moses to give the inheritance to Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah and Tirzah. The people of Israel were still camped in the wilderness, still preparing to enter the land that God had promised. The new law about inheritance was already known. But another question soon came up. If the daughters of Zelophehad now owned land, what would happen if they married men from another tribe? In Israel, when a woman married, she became part of her husband's tribe. If Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah and Tirzah married outside their father's tribe, their land would go with them into another tribe. That meant the land that had been given to their father would no longer belong to his family's tribe. This could create big problems in the future. God saw this potential problem. He gave a simple and wise answer to protect the land and the tribes. He told Moses to instruct the people that the daughters of Zelophehad could marry anyone they wanted, but the man must be from their father's tribal clan. In other words, they were free to choose, but their choice had to be within their own tribe. This way the land would not pass from one tribe to another. Each tribe would keep the inheritance of its fathers. The Bible tells us that Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah and Tirzah obeyed this command. They married their cousins on their father's side. By doing this they kept the land allotment intact. They followed the Lord's instruction and their family's share of the promised land stayed where it belonged. This story shows how God cares about the details of our lives. He not only gave the sisters their inheritance, but he also provided a way to protect it. He wanted to make sure their father's name and portion would stay within the tribe of Manasseh. God is not careless. He is thoughtful and fair. It also shows the obedience of the 5 sisters. They had been bold and courageous when they asked for the inheritance. And when God gave them a command about marriage, they were willing to obey. Their faith was not only in asking but also in following God's direction. They trusted that His way was best. Throughout the Bible we see something very beautiful about God's heart. He always cares for those who are weak, forgotten or without help. He calls Himself the Father of the fatherless. He protects the widow. He defends the stranger who has no one else. And here, in the story of Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah and Tirzah, we see Him doing it again. By listening to the 5 sisters, God showed that He does not overlook the needs of women or orphans. He does not forget the families who have no sons. He makes a way for their name and their inheritance to continue. This is who He is, a loving Father who gives justice. The Bible says that a father to the fatherless and a judge and protector of the widows is God in His holy dwelling. It says that He gives food and clothing to the stranger. It says that He notices the suffering of the helpless and takes it into His hands. He asks His people to care as He cares. He invites us to join Him in doing what is right and fair. The 5 sisters' courage is also a lesson for us. They were living in a time when women had little power. They could have kept quiet. They could have said, "This is just how things are." But they believed that God was fair. They believed His promise of the land. And because they believed, they spoke up. Courage in the Bible is often called good cheer. It means boldness and confidence. It is the opposite of fear. When God says, "Do not be afraid," or "Be of good courage," He is telling us to stand against fear. He is inviting us to trust Him. Think about this. The 5 sisters came to the entrance of the tabernacle. The place where the leaders met and, more importantly, the place where God Himself dwelt among His people. They were not only appealing to Moses, they were appealing to God. They were standing before the Judge of all the earth, trusting Him to defend their rights. And He did. Their story tells us that courage and faith go together. Faith believes God's promise. Courage acts on that belief. These sisters had both. They were informed, they were bold, and they were respectful. And because of that, their case brought about a permanent law in Israel to protect others in the same situation. We should remember this when we face our own challenges. God calls us to bring our needs to Him. He calls us to speak the truth with respect. He calls us to trust His justice. And when He gives us instructions, He calls us to obey them, just as Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah and Tirzah did. The story of Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah and Tirzah is not just a small footnote in the Bible. It is a powerful picture of God's fairness and of human courage. By coming to Moses at the entrance of the tabernacle, the sisters showed that they trusted the God who defends the weak. They knew that He would listen to them. And He did more than listen. He changed the law of inheritance to include daughters when there were no sons. This was a great act of justice in their time. Canaan, the land God promised, was not only a place to live. It was also a sign of fellowship with God. It was a sign of His kingdom. If someone was left out of the inheritance, they were also being left out of the community and of God's promise. By giving the sisters their share, God was showing that His fellowship and His promises are for all who believe, men and women alike. The sisters' courage still speaks to us today. They remind us that we can bring our needs and our troubles to God. We can do it with respect. We can do it with faith. And we can trust Him to do what is right. They also remind us that when God gives us an instruction, our blessing is protected when we obey, just as their inheritance was protected when they obeyed God's instruction about marriage. So let us learn from Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah and Tirzah. Let us be people who believe God's promises, who stand up with courage, and who follow His ways. Let us be people who care for the fatherless, the widow and the stranger, just as He does. Justice is part of God's heart. When we act with justice and kindness, we show the world what He is like. If this teaching about Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah and Tirzah has blessed you, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. By subscribing you'll never miss more hidden Bible stories and lessons of faith and courage like this one.